Hello, I believe we are now live. Welcome to Critical Witness. I've got Dan here as usual, and we're joined by another Glenn. If you've watched our last episode, we've now got Glenn Peoples with us, Dr. Glenn Peoples with us, and we're going to be talking about all sorts of different things today. I've titled the video Morality, Psychology and God. But this could go anywhere, and we'll see how long we last this time. We lasted 2 hours with Glenn before. How long are we thinking, Glenn?
I see. We'll go for an hour. We'll go for an hour, and then we'll see what happens.
Sounds good. Yeah, we'll start off gently. So, just so everyone knows who you are. You've got your website, rightreason.org, and you've written about all sorts of different topics, and lots of them are interesting. And
some of them,
all the ones I've read so far have held my attention. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and, a little bit of your story. When did you become a Christian, and why do you write articles about faith?
I mean, I'm no one really. I became a Christian. I grew up in the Catholic faith, so it was always an important component of my life and my family life. Like a lot of people who are now not Catholic but who are still Christian, I did this whole finding out about Catholicism, and I got to the shock of some people, rebaptized in my teens. And like a lot of people who leave the Catholic Church but remain Christians, I initially was very hostile to it. I've mellowed a lot since then. I'm Anglican now, so that should give you some indicator. Some people say, "Oh, you've come halfway back home." Well, not quite, but yeah. I got into Christian academia, kind of. Many years ago when I decided, maybe I'll be a pastor. And so I went off to Bible college and did my undergraduate degree in divinity, and then I sort of caught the academic bug and decided, maybe I won't be a pastor, maybe I'll teach, I'll be a lecturer. So I went and did a couple of other degrees to get a master's degree in theology, a PhD in philosophy, all the most useful degrees in the world. And realized, like a lot of people, that academia, that kind of academia in theology and philosophy, there aren't just jobs everywhere. It's not really I mean, it's beneficial for a lot of other fields, but I ended up basically accepting that professional academia in those fields was very unlikely. And so I entered the corporate world and started gaining a whole bunch of other skill sets and whatnot. But more recently, I'm definitely heading towards something a bit more vocational, something pastoral, but I know not what at this point. And that's partly because of the church environment that I'm in, namely the Anglican one, is so uncertain. There's a lot going on in terms of change. The old Anglican Guard is incredibly liberal and not really an environment that is conducive to intellectually vibrant evangelical faith. But there are also some important revival movements going on within Anglicanism, and I think of GAFCON, for those who are familiar with it, which is really quite encouraging. So we'll see what happens there. But one of the things that I've decided is that if I'm going to be going into any sort of pastoral ministry, it would be really beneficial to have a background in psychology. That was prompted also by my relationships with a number of people in my life for whom psychology is a big issue. And so that's what I'm doing now. I'm still working full time. I'm an application support analyst for the government in my day job. But I'm studying towards a psychology degree, well, the undergraduate one anyway, and there'll probably be another degree after that. So I'm a student again, and I stay sane by building guitars,
which you're very good at. I mean, I don't make guitars, but they always look very, very impressive.
They do look nice, yes. Thank you.
I would have one just to put on the wall. I wouldn't be able to do anything with it, but my brothers might.
Ornament.
So you're now doing psychology and looking to do pastoral side of things. So this psychology degree that you're in, how long is it going to last for? Are you going straight into masters?
Well, so I'm doing it part-time, and I started at the beginning of last year. And it's full-time. It's 3 years for the undergrad degree. It's a Bachelor of Applied Science in Psychology. It'll be about 4.5 years to do this degree for me. But then if you're going to be a psychologist, a bachelor's degree is not enough. You then have to complete a master's and then some supervision. So, it's fairly long term at this point. I'm looking at least 8 years.
Sounds fun. I'm not sure 8 years. Psychology, I enjoyed listening to my wife and what she did as an undergrad, and Dan's wife also. That's kind of how we met, through our prospective wives, and they both did psychology. So I've got a little flavour of what psychology looks like, but my understanding of it is minimal. With Christianity, and I'm guessing you're doing this through a secular university.
That's right, yeah, the Open Polytechnic of New Zealand.
Right. Where do you see the overlap? Are you going towards counselling with psychology, talking about pastoral care? Or?
So I'm not looking at being something that you'd call a counsellor, although there'll be counselling involved. There are a number of options in the field, but I'm thinking something along the lines of clinical psychology.
That's fair enough. Yeah. And are there any sort of pet subjects within psychology that you see clashing with Christianity that have already kind of bubbled to the surface that you go,
well,
I'm not sure that?
I mean, psychology. It's like is there a problem in science? If you're going to be a Christian, will that clash with science? Well, well, psychology doesn't have opinions, of course. It's just a field of study. But yeah, there are certain orthodoxies that I think are both harmful and incompatible with I think any sort of robust Christian worldview, especially around, at the moment anyway, the whole field of both sexuality and gender identity. Now, it's not as bad as well, it doesn't seem so far to be as bad as some alarmists might think. There is room for disagreement on the nature of gender identity and the appropriateness of gender as the distinguisher between men and women, for example. But so it's not really in the academy that you're going to face opposition, because you can ask almost any question. It's in the culture. If you say the wrong thing on Twitter and anyone knows who you are, you can lose your job and be hounded and receive threats and all sorts of things like that. That, I think, really is where the danger is.
Have you read the article by J.K. Rowling?
I haven't, although I was surprised that it was only making news now. I follow a lot of people who would describe themselves as gender critical feminists on Twitter, because I disagree with them about lots of things, but we have considerable overlap in what we would say about gender. And J.K. Rowling made her comments a long time ago, and the furor has been bubbling ever since. It's just recently that she's decided to explain herself more fully. I don't know whether she thinks she's going to placate anyone, because she's seen the sorts of people who are concerned about what she said, and they're not going to be placated.
No. Yeah, she seems to have sort of thrown caution to the wind the last week or two, and it's interesting.
It's so great that there are people, well, so far anyway, one person who can afford to throw caution to the wind because she's J.K. Rowling, and who have decided to use their voice in such a good way. Yeah.
Well, she's me and my wife were talking about this yesterday. She's untouchable in a way. Once you get to those sort of echelons of you're not dependent on anyone. She doesn't need anyone. She doesn't need money. She doesn't need fame. She's if that's what she was after. So she's kind of free. She has a freedom that a lot of people don't have. Like I would say, most of us don't have that degree of freedom, because our speech is always somewhat reined in by, fear of, of loss of something that we wouldn't want to lose. So it's quite, we almost rely on people who are untouchable in a way to say the things that probably a substantial proportion of the population are thinking, but either are too scared or are not free to communicate those ideas. And that's what's so interesting about J.K. Rowling, as you were saying, is, I probably wouldn't agree with her on a lot of things, but probably on the gender critical stance, I probably would err to that. And I don't feel like I have the freedom necessary to voice those things, but she can, and I can sort of, share a post,
Yeah, so this is, I don't want to call it a mistake because it's the way that I would have wanted to conduct myself, but this is a mistake, some would say, that I made as soon as I started blogging. I just said what I thought was true.
Yeah. But it hasn't cost, I don't know, maybe it's done, I don't know, but it doesn't seem to have cost you. I don't know.
I suspect it has cost me. I've never held an academic post.
Right.
Is there anything specific that you think would have done that?
Well, I mean, in the conservative evangelical world, there are a few doctrines that I both hold and defend, which would immediately have me booted out. So I'm not a dualist about human nature. That's a big deal. I'm an annihilationist. Well, that's huge. And they're every bit as censorial and prohibitive as the woke mob. It's just that there are different shibboleths.
Yeah. And hell is definitely one of the sort of untouchable doctrines at the moment, as we've talked about elsewhere, but that might well come up a little bit more in the conversation. I mean, just with J.K. Rowling and being untouchable, do you think that's actually true? Do you reckon there's a danger that if one person in her position speaks out without the support of academia, or though she's used academic sides to it to speak out, there's potentially a danger that she just becomes called the wacky person with money that we can ignore?
That's absolutely a risk, but what does she care? It's not gonna, she invented Harry Potter. She's a millionaire.
Maybe not for her to care. I mean, just those of us who may be watching this from the side, thinking, "Oh, great, someone has spoken that has the power to." Is it worth more? Is it a time for more people to actually speak?
Oh, of course, it's always a time for people to speak and to have courage and to. Because this is how the mob becomes the mob. It's because it is allowed to become the prevailing culture, which isn't challenged.
We've just had some feedback that the feed is having difficulty. Let us know in the live chat if you can hear us okay. Is it? I can hear it fine when I test it out. We'll just keep going and we'll see what happens. Hopefully, between Zoom and YouTube, they'll sort it out. Dan, if you keep talking with Glenn for a minute, I'll see if there's a technical thing I can fix.
Yeah, no, I think even if you look at the amount of support that someone like J.K. Rowling's got for her, bringing her sort of perspective, I would say it vastly outweighs criticism. But I think the thing about the criticism is it's much louder. So you end up with a very warped view of what the majority of people hold. And I often think that these are incredibly minority. These views are a minority, but the people that hold them shout so loud that you end up perceiving that they're the ones in the majority.
Yeah, and the nature of the activism is so very different. You can troll through a very unpleasant archive of photos and texts that imply or directly state threats from male transgender activists, many of whom would identify as women, threats of violence, threats of sexual assault, threats of death, photos of weapons, things like that are sent to women who speak about this. And I know everyone likes to say this about their side, but there is absolutely no equivalence in the other direction.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, because I've heard, I would be surprised if that's the case, only because, even for something, I know the three of us would consider ourselves pro-life in the sense that we are anti-abortion. I know pro-life encompasses a little bit more than that, but you see people who are pro-life, making death threats and against people, which is completely insane. It's not a coherent view. But I try on Twitter. I try and follow people like gender critical and people who are, I just can't get on board with, they at least say similar things, that they get abuse as well. Now, maybe not pictures of weapons and things like that, but I think, and maybe not the level, maybe not so much. I would be surprised at the level, but
now gender critical feminists receive this all the time.
Yeah. I'm trying. No, I'm not surprised.
Twitter's a bit like that. I've always been interested to see how Twitter has been given so much power, or that the mob has been given so much power, that both the media play off of it, and you find these articles that are just talking about the story of the day, and then Joe Blogs on Twitter has said this, and he gets his comment viewed on the news feed like he's an expert on the matter, when he could well be a bot. I mean, it's just, you have no idea, and so there's an element within Twitter, you don't actually know if you're speaking to a bot or just. I know I've had some really random responses to the stuff that I've shared over time, and even on YouTube now, generally the first comment is some bot that's said, "I love your content, be my friend," and you end up with Twitter, even though you can't trust who you're interacting with, you have this engagement that suddenly can lose people their jobs and can really harm things that are, sure, they're sensitive topics in the sense that people's identities are wrapped up in them, but you should be able to have a conversation around it without
and people talk about mediums like Twitter and even Wikipedia as though it were a sort of democratic approach, because everyone has a say. But the thing is, 90% of the sound is coming from 5% of the people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always find it interesting that I know it gets thrown around a bit, but it almost is like a secular religion in the sense that you can identify a liturgy, you can identify the sin, you can identify heresy, and it's kind of what they almost take the kind of worst caricatures of religion as a whole, and then apply it to their thing, and are completely unaware that that's what they're doing, because that's what it is. It's like, if you're a gender critical feminist, if that's how you would describe yourself, that's heresy, and it's considered heresy, and you can see the strength in which those views are met, and
it's not just wrong.
Yeah, it's more than that. You're right. It's not just wrong. It's not just something we can disagree about. It's much stronger than that. In the same way,
it's violence.
Many years ago, and when I was still entertaining hopes of professional academia, so that's a long time ago, I pondered, and I don't know why I never did it. I think I just didn't have time, writing an article called "Heresy as Hate Speech," how people, and I think at the time it was because there was a discussion in New Zealand about removing some old legislation because blasphemous libel was still on the books as a crime, and I had no particular issue with it being removed, but it struck me as how like laws against heresy and blasphemy are concerns about hate speech and the way that people are punished in more or less the same way.
That's interesting. I know I've clocked that it's very much like shame. we're turning into a morality that's wrapped around shame, and if you're not towing the line in various things, you'll be cancelled, you'll be shunned, you'll be expelled from whichever society or group that you're meant to be a part of, and both employers and politicians are playing that game as well.
And you're right. It is a shame thing. It's not an engagement thing, and it's not a refutation thing. And if you point out to people that they're not really engaging, you'll get a response along the lines of, "Well, we don't engage with Nazis." And that sort of language is far more violent than they realize. I mean, what did we do to the Nazis?
Yeah.
You know, we shot them. You know, we hanged them. We put them on trial and killed them. Yeah. I don't think there's much appreciation. I mean, there's no filter between these naive, violent impulses and the output on Twitter.
Bruce Blackshaw's on the chat saying that the Twitter sphere does seem to believe in objective moral values, though.
Oh, very much so, dogmatically so. do
they prove God that they're objective morals?
well, yeah. Good luck convincing them. Good luck convincing any of them to think long and hard enough about anything like the basis of objective moral fact.
Well, that maybe segues us into maybe talking just very briefly about the moral argument.
Yeah. There you go. Well, look at that. We're professionals here.
Look at that.
We'll have 7 subscribers in no time.
Because I know you've written a fair bit about the moral argument. I'd say, am I a fan? I know of philosophical arguments for God. I'm slightly, I don't know, dubious of their merit, but of them, I think definitely my favourite would be the moral argument. I wonder if you could maybe, for people listening, sort of sketch it out a little bit, and what value it has, you know.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, the most well-known form of the moral argument would be something along the lines of, if there are objective moral truths, then God exists. There are objective moral truths, and so God exists. Most of the war is waged around, well, it depends. In popular culture, most of the war is waged around the first premise, the conditional premise, namely, if there are moral truths, then God exists. I'm strongly inclined to think that premise is true, and that's what does pretty much all the work here. Pretty much, you know, in philosophy, some people have convinced themselves that there are no moral truths. That's their out, but most people aren't prepared to say that, especially, you know, woke people, because they know that some things are right and wrong. They're just wrong about which ones. So the idea is that if there are moral truths, moral facts is what the phrase that I've used, and I've noticed that since I've started publishing articles and giving talks using the phrase moral facts, it started appearing more in the Christian apologetics community. I'm going to take some credit for that.
No, do it.
So if there are moral facts, then their explanation is either natural or non-natural. You could say not natural or supernatural, but some people don't like that, but it means the same thing.
Yeah.
And those categories are supposed to be construed as mutually exclusive. There's nothing else available other than what's natural and what's not. And then I think that the best explanation of moral facts, if there are any, is non-natural, because, you know, natural facts are just facts about what is. They are measurements of what is out there. They are not teleological in nature. They don't tell you what should be the case. They just tell you what is the case. But moral facts aren't simply descriptive. They're also prescriptive. And natural facts tend not to be like that. I'm moving fairly quickly. And if the best explanation, if the explanation of moral facts is non-natural, then the best explanation is that there is a non-natural person involved. And this is where some people raise their eyebrow and go, what do you mean? And moral facts have opinions. And that might seem like a weird thing to say, but moral facts want you to do some things and not others. They have, you know, you encounter, and not everyone will buy this initially too, but I think it's true at a psychological level. You encounter moral facts in the way that you encounter the commandments of a person. And if there is a non-natural person who is the best explanation of moral facts, then that person is something very much like what we call God. And it runs. That's more or less the argument. Right at the end of the argument, though, of course, people can escape the existence of God by digging their heels into what some people would regard as quite implausible, and just say, well, then there are no moral facts. There's nothing to be explained, and you can do that. And that's why I mean, I think the moral argument is sound, but I can easily see how it could be unpersuasive to some people, because they would sooner give up the possibility that God exists than they would. Sorry, they're willing to give up God rather than embrace moral realism, even though moral realism and that seems like to me a huge price to pay, but people are very willing to pay it, because God is a demanding, moralistic thing. The demand of believing in God, if you take it seriously, the God who commands, the God who is the basis of moral facts, is also a God that you can't ignore.
Yeah.
So what do you think are some of the strongest objections to the moral argument? I think sort of in mind that have someone like Eric Weilenberg, kind of argues that the moral facts are a kind of sui generis feature of the universe, which is a really interesting view. I think I've the critics that I've kind of read, I find him probably the most persuasive out of them. I don't know if that's fair.
Well, I don't know about persuasive, because I don't see him offering, well, not in my view anyway, a good case that that's what morality is like. But yeah, I find him to have the most coherent objection. So his view, for viewers who aren't, it's Eric Weilenberg, isn't it? Isn't that how you say it?
Yeah, sorry, Weilenberg or Weilenberg. Yeah,
I'm glad you're explaining it. I'll be the viewer that doesn't have a clue what you're talking about.
Yeah. So his view is, well, it's a kind of, it's moral realism. So there are moral facts, and it's moral non-naturalism. The idea is that those facts are not explained in terms of any other thing, but rather they're like a Platonic form. They're like a Platonic object that just exists in and of itself, and they need no further basis. So you can, and that can be labeled in a number of ways: sui generis or just brute. No, I think they're a fairly ad hoc thing. I mean, how would you even know which moral facts existed? There is, I think, a significant epistemological block there. I don't see how they could convey the nature of their existence to you, and not only that, but it's very far from being a simple view. I mean, there is more than one moral truth, and so for every moral truth, there must be depending on how you construe it, a non-natural entity explaining them.
So if we're sort of looking more specifically like divine command ethics and the moral argument, what does that commit you to any particular moral epistemology? Like, because I've always been interested in sort of like natural law and things like that.
I don't think that it does, and I know that. I know, and I wrote an article a little while ago called "The Epistemological Objection to Divine Command Ethics," because some people have raised the concern that if ethics is grounded in God at all, let alone in God's commands, then those who don't believe in God wouldn't. You're saying that atheists can't be moral or can't know right from wrong or something like that, and that's just not true at all. That's like saying, if you believe that God created the world, then atheists can't do science because they don't know where it came from. Well, that's just false. I think moral facts are real, and I think God created us in such a way as to be able to perceive them. I don't see any particular block. Now, having said that, if you believe in God, and you pay attention to His revelation in Scripture, I think you're going to be aware of more moral obligations, but I don't have any issue at all with that. I think, for example, you shall
love
love
your neighbor
the Lord
as yourself.
Yeah, well, I think most people can pick up on that one. But something like "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength." That's to put it mildly, just more apparent from Scripture than it is from nature. And I have no issue with the fact that atheists are pushing away certain moral facts by virtue of their rejection of God. but I don't see that as much of an objection to the theory. There is much that they can know about God just by virtue of the fact that God made them to hear his voice.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean love your enemies. I said I meant in my head, love your enemies.
Oh, I see.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, like love your enemies.
I could do that. Although, depends if your neighbour is an enemy, then you got a problem.
That's true.
Yeah,
that's true.
Just on a sort of more popular level, you've got people like Sam Harris that would say, well, actually, we can science our way towards moral facts.
Yeah, he doesn't science his way to moral facts. So what Sam Harris does is he, the best short introduction to Sam Harris, he gives his TED talk on the subject of when his book, The Moral Landscape, came out. And he basically says, well, of course, there are scientific answers to moral questions because there are scientific answers to the questions of how to promote human flourishing. And I thought, yes, there are scientific answers to the question of how to promote human flourishing, but those aren't moral facts. No. The moral fact would be something along the lines of, you ought to promote human flourishing, and science doesn't tell you that.
No, that's a significant difference of where you start. And I found Sam Harris's whole book to be floundering on just that premise of this idea that flourishing is any way to base our morality on, and who's flourishing. What if the option is one or the other? Do we only promote by flourishing?
Well, I remember. I suppose you could adopt for a utilitarian approach, the flourishing of the many as opposed to the flourishing of the one. I remember towards the end of, I think it was his debate with William Lane Craig, where he reproduced all of his errors, and he was challenging Bill. I can call him Bill. I have a PhD as well, you see. He was challenging him on the whole notion that atheism doesn't provide a foundation for morality, and he was saying something along the lines of, look, we know how, there are some things that are just obvious. He said, take two outcomes, or consider the possibility of someone suffering as much as is humanly possible for their entire life. There are facts about how we can stop that. And he said, and if we have any obligations at all, we have an obligation to do that. You don't realize that the whole issue is hiding under the rock of, if we have any obligations at all.
Yeah. Well, that's like a feature of morality is that there's an oughtness to it, and so he doesn't have any. He's not able to bridge from a statement of fact about the world to why that ought to be the case.
Yeah. Why should the world be a certain way? Yeah.
Phil, were you gonna?
No, I was just agreeing. You look like you're about to ask a question.
No. I thought you were going to follow up. So what role? I'd be interested. Like, what role do you think sort of philosophical arguments for God kind of play in apologetics and evangelism? Like, do they have any roles? I often think sort of it seems to be sort of in-house jousting. About more than I've never met. Go on.
Yeah, so for example, I just recently left because I got sick of it, belonged to a very popular Christian apologetics Facebook group. And so often what happens in groups like that is people will come along and say, hey, look, here's this doctrine that I disagree with. As an apologist, how can I oppose it? And it's a Christian doctrine that a whole bunch of believers hold. And so there's a serious misunderstanding of why apologetics exists. And people just equate apologetics with arguing about whatever, really.
Is it not? Have I been?
Yeah. I mean, when you really, apologia, and this is something that every apologist is taught. Apologia was a courtroom term for giving a defense. So it was giving an account of what you believe and some reasons to accept your account. And that's what apologetics is. And that includes...
Don't forget 1 Peter 3:15 or 2 Peter 3:15. That goes alongside it every time.
Yeah. Well, and rightly so, I think. And they seem to, not always catch the last part of that, which says, but do it with gentleness and respect.
No, that's not in my Bible. I scratched it out.
Yeah, but look, I mean, I think apologetics has value. I don't like the fact that apologetics has become sort of an industry in itself, because it was never that. It was never that in Scripture. There were never people who were into apologetics. There were Christians, and at some point they would give an account of their faith and explain why they had that faith. But it really has become an industry. The books that pour out, and I love apologetics. I don't necessarily like apologists. That's one way to put it.
We talked to this we brought this up, didn't we? I think with Glenn Shivner as well, about these whole apologist ministries. That they can spend their whole careers never engaging someone who's not a Christian, because you can just and that like you, that seems slightly absurd to me, because we'd all consider Apostle Paul an apologist, but he was also an evangelist. That it wasn't apologetics wasn't an end in itself. It was simply the means to being equipped to engaging the Greeks and the Jews and the etc. So it's
But look, I think apologetics does have great value, and it may be that it has greater value for Christians, and that's all right. Because generally speaking, the doubts that Christians are going to face are not rational in nature, and this is going to depend on what everyone's individual psychological makeup is like as to what sorts of doubts they face. But I face it. I still face it now. But there is immense value in being able to analyze those doubts and say these are emotional doubts. These are just emotional states, really, that are created by the circumstances in which I often find myself, or just because, or just when the mind wanders and you start saying things like, what if? And that's entirely not rational in nature, and it's really, really useful, life-saving, to be able to reflect on the fact that no, there are actually very good rational reasons to believe that Christianity is true. In those moments, that's a fantastic thing. So apologetics as an in-house thing is not the end of the world for me. How much? I don't know, and I guess it would be a matter of empirical inquiry. How much impact the apologetics industry has on people who are not Christians, because most of what I see is it just provokes people who are particularly antsy in their atheism to fight back. And it would never have benefited them in the first place, because they're just looking for a fight, like some apologists are, to be fair.
It's easy to on Twitter, as we've already discussed. Though it's not exactly a place full of gentleness and respect. I avoided Twitter, and then I started it for this and my other channel, and I just find myself. You just find yourself getting caught up in, or I do, in trying to prove something. And you kind of come out of the conversation of, well, I didn't win, even if I got my point across. I didn't. Just kind of empty argument.
So it would be an issue of empirical inquiry, because I do believe that apologetics makes a positive difference. It makes a negative difference too for some people, because it just hardens them in their resolve to find a good response. Not that they'll find a good one, but it makes them more interested in fighting with us. But there are people for whom are really winsome, not necessarily technical and full-on academic, but a winsome and clear demonstration that actually there is a reasonableness to this. Those are the people for whom I think it has great value.
I think for me personally, that's exactly what it was when I came to making the decision for myself, because I grew up in a Christian family, but ended up having to make a decision around university to actually, is this my faith? And around that point, it was around the apologetics around the resurrection that really went, actually, this is reasonable, that there are good reasons to trust the Gospels, good reasons to trust the account of so the creed in Corinthians that Christ died, was buried, and rose again, and there's this testimony that follows on from that. And so there was a definite apologetics around it, but alongside that, I also made the decision to pray and to read the Bible more, and the two have to go hand in hand. And I do distinctly remember to stop reading my Bible like I'm an atheist and actually start expecting God to speak through it. So I think the two do go hand in hand, but depending on the apologetics and philosophy, I think is very highbrow, high level philosophy that it goes well over my head. And I end up going, I don't see this dealing with my life and the certain things that we face daily. And why does it matter? There's a moral argument when life is poop right now. I think that's where apologetics needs to work on. And what I'm seeing in the apologetics world is actually an in-house debate as to whether or not you're sticking with Romans and no one's really an atheist and it's all presuppositionalist, or you're a rationalist. And then there's this sort of back and forth between certain channels fighting over that. It's like, well, maybe it's a bit of both.
Yeah, well, I think it is a bit of both. And since you raised it just now, and I don't know how much this will mean to your audience, depends on on their familiarity with different apologetics schools of thought. But yeah, there is the whole presuppositional. I was going to say there are multiple schools of thought, like classical evidentialist, presuppositionalist, and so on. But basically, it's presuppositionalist versus everybody else.
It sounds about right. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you're not with them, you're definitely against. No, but this is my segue into saying that actually they're not wrong about everything. I think that a transcendental argument for non-naturalism is fairly good. It's just that I think that presuppositionalists don't really understand it. Many of them anyway, they seem to think that you must presuppose not merely non-naturalism in order to get to things like logic, science, morality, and whatnot, but you must presuppose biblical Trinitarian Christianity in order to make sense of any of this. And I've never, ever seen a good argument for that.
Seems a stretch.
To put it mildly.
Yeah. And especially if you've never heard of any of those terms before. It does seem it presupposes a Western ideal of Christianity before it gets to any of those.
And it involves a lot of slogans too that I don't think the proponents of presuppositional apologetics usually understand or could unpack if asked to. So it'll be something like, well, if you're engaging with people and trying to convince them on rational terms that God exists, then you're meeting them on their own territory. Well, what does that mean? And I think that's where things start to get a bit muddy, and you start to hear accusations of being unfaithful, being intellectually unfaithful. But why exactly is logic and science meeting unbelievers on their own territory? I mean, don't presuppositionalists believe that those things are actually the theists' home turf?
Well, only if it's true science with a capital T.
I think it would be interesting to do like a survey of presuppositional apologists, or not apologists necessarily, but people who hold that perspective, and find out how many of them became Christians on the basis of presuppositional apologetics. It would just be interesting to find out if 80% of people became Christians, not on the basis of sort of.
As someone with an interest in psychology, we should be very suspicious of self-reporting about why you did something, because what happens is we do something, and then in retrospect we write a story about why we did it, and that story is going to be written in light of what we now believe. And if they're now presuppositionalists, then the explanation will be, well, it will be a presuppositional one.
That's true. Yeah. Motivated reasoning. That's probably true. Maybe moving away a bit from this now, I'd be interested to, given all the what would be a word, turmoil, discussion going on in regards to George Floyd's death. It might be interesting just to talk a bit about what I read some of your comments on Facebook and things. I know me and Phil have had a few discussions around this as well, but just kind of looking at what you think about the sort of Christian response to racism. What is it? What have you perceived that to be, and what should it be? What should it be as well?
Honestly, I mean, the world is burning, isn't it? It's just crazy. I mean, it's happening. I mean, in New Zealand now, there are demonstrations and people talking about pulling down old statues and whatnot. I mean, obviously, this isn't all because of George Floyd's death, but that was the catalyst that people said, you know what, let's just bring it all out of the closet now and deal with it. Man, but yeah, Christians don't always help themselves in response to these sorts of things, and so I try not to push too hard, because there are limits as to what people can hear, and there are limits as to what people can accept, and you should, with some people you do have to take a very gentle incremental approach, but that's not really me. So I've been not really trolling, but I've been trying to be a bit of a stone in people's shoe, or my fellow Christians' shoe anyway, on this issue lately, because I think that some of them need to hear it in ways that they're not really willing to hear it, and that needs to change. But what I'll do is I'll just bring up one issue, and I'll just focus on that one issue and talk about it and try to show people that it's reasonable and state it in ways that I think are reasonable. And so the one that I've decided to bring up a lot lately is the whole issue of privilege, and the issue of white privilege. Now, white privilege isn't a special thing. It's just privilege had by white people. Um, and of course, all it really amounts to is the acknowledgement of the fact, and it really is a fact, and I think there's no serious denying that it's a fact, that in developed nations like the United States or Canada or in the UK or New Zealand, where we have an ethnically diverse population, but we definitely have a white majority and a history where the white majority has used, well, I don't want to talk about it as though it's a collective entity, but where minorities have suffered disadvantages. It is just true that being white bestows upon you certain advantages, and they're often very subtle advantages, but the aggregation of all those advantages put together is what we call white privilege, the privilege of being white. And it'll be, for example, the attitude that law enforcement has to you, the way that people look at you. I mean, two people walking down the street dressed fairly scruffily. One of them is me, well, when I don't have a freshly cut mohawk and I'm looking a bit respectable, and one of them is a young Maori guy. In New Zealand, the Maori people, we don't really have African Americans because we're not America, but that would be an example. They're going to look at us differently, and their expectations about our behavior will be different, and expectations about academic success and the way that we are treated is at multiple levels. In ways that affect our opportunities in life, in long-term ways that are quite drastic. Those differences exist, and that's
Can I interject while we're doing this? I'm just thinking, because I'm going to have multiple questions, I think, as you discuss this. So something. So when you mentioned about, you said the Maui and yourself. Now another way to view that would be that, at least over here, maybe in somewhere like the US and the UK, is another explanation for that could also be based on classism. So if I'm walking past a white person in a suit, you'll know, as in studying psychology, we have certain heuristics. We work through certain mental health shortcuts that make life livable, in a way. So if I walk past a smart white man in a suit, and I walk past a black person, maybe, or maybe another ethnic minority, or even a white person, any color of someone, say in a hoodie, I might, through a sort of using that sort of heuristic, I might engender the belief that that person may be more of a threat than the person in a suit. Even if
Yeah.
it could be a black person in a suit, Asian person in a suit, or white person in a suit, they're less of a threat because I have the heuristic based on perhaps personal experience, media, all sorts of things that have shown me that I should be, that the person in a hoodie is more of a threat to my safety than someone in a suit.
Yeah.
It's when you have.
Yeah, that's true. So in my example, we were both dressed the same.
Yeah.
And So and absolutely. I mean, white privilege. This is why I don't talk so much about white privilege. I just talk about privilege, because being white isn't the only thing that gives you privilege. Being a good-looking person is, and people overlook how much of a privilege that is. This is it's referred to as hot privilege. It's real. It makes a massive difference. And all we're doing when we talk about white privilege is acknowledging that in the sorts of societies we're talking about, being white is one of those things that gives you privilege. And class as well. So, two black people, obviously from different classes, that's going to make a difference. Two people from apparently the same sort of financial and educational background, one is white, one is black, they will not be treated the same.
And I think if I was to walk around or even drive around in tracksuit trousers and like just a scruffy top, I wouldn't even need to consider, actually, I might be stopped. I'm going to have to make sure my wallet's with me, make sure my insurance and my car's all sorted. But I know for a fact that friends of mine who are black, in their first couple of years of driving, they were stopped multiple times, even if they had dressed smart, and they had to make sure that they had to have their wallet with them, their papers all sorted. So it's thing.
Where's that? Sorry, is that in the UK?
Yeah, that was Brighton.
Right.
So I think with it's the fact that I don't have to think about race at all in the UK, because that's the
and see, for some people, that's what forms their response. They're like, "What do you mean race is an issue? I've never experienced anything like that." Well, of course you haven't. And the Christian response when people raise these concerns is really unhelpful. And sometimes the response from people who have spent a lot of time studying this issue is really unhelpful, because the particular things that they study skew their perspective. So if you get, for example, a person, and I've had this, people who are really, really interested in things like cultural Marxism and in debunking the Black Lives Matters organization and movement, which is not what I'm talking about, or critical race theory, they'll be very sensitive to these terms. And whenever you start mentioning them, we're like, oh, so you're aligning yourself with the Marxists, you're aligning yourself with the critical race theorists. No, I'm not. These concepts existed independently of these organizations and movements. And it's just really unhelpful that Christians have started to associate the two. And it's really damaging too, because when I raise a concern or just a statement or an observation about racism, and people assume that I'm on, verbally in public in front of others on Facebook, start assuming that I'm a Marxist or I'm on the left, what that means is, and what and how that will be seen by everyone else is, my culture, conservative Christianity, doesn't care about those things. If you raise those concerns, that makes you on the left. What a load of nonsense, but what a horrible way to depict the conservative Christian right.
Yeah, I've seen those threads both on your feed and even on my own, where I've talked about white privilege, and the responses are very much distractions from the topic, or denying it exists, then also worrying about the language. It is interesting to watch, but it is unhelpful, and I think it shows on my thread who's actually engaging in those conversations, and it's not anyone from the backgrounds that actually are experiencing it. And I find that actually quite worrying, that all my friends who are black, Asian, whatever minority we're talking about, they're just watching. And I've got this thread full of people who some of them are just really searching. They're searching for the right language to put on it, but there's this lack of listening, I guess, going on, and I'm trying to explain.
It's like a bunch of men arguing about what it's like to have a period.
I think
it must look like it.
I think one way to look at it as well is that people, you have to think as well what the type of the messages that people are getting. Now, if all we mean by white privilege is that you have the privilege of not experiencing racism, I mean, that just seems self-evidently true. But I think, especially, in the countries, represented here and the US, if you're a white person, you're highly unlikely. There might be some minorities that have prejudice towards white people, but largely you're very unlikely to experience it in a way that's going to affect any, significant outcome in your life. But I think the problem is what people are reading. If the stuff that comes through on your Facebook feed and on Twitter is from people who are, perhaps more on the critical race theorist side, who are saying things, and you're thinking, well, if I admit I have white privilege, I'm admitting to these things. Someone like Robin DiAngelo and these types of people they're kind of saying that I'm just a racist, and there's nothing. And even when you say you're not a racist, well, that's actually a racist thing to say, because it's. So I think what happens, I think a more charitable approach is that criticism is rooted in the messages that they're receiving. Because I think if as I said, if all we mean by that, it's just self-evidently true. But I have other concerns. Because I know I had discussed it with Phil, and you'll be interested in this too, Glenn. Is when if you deliver. There was a psychology study done last year, I think, or maybe the year before, is that when people undergo white privilege training, what happens is that they're more likely to hold then disparaging, discriminatory views against white people who are under the poverty line. So they then hold more positive views about African Americans, which is great. But what happens, because if by being white you by default have privilege and access, basically an advantage, a leg up. If you're white and you're poor, the only explanation can be is that you failed to take advantage of the advantage of your white privilege, and so you don't really deserve sympathy. And that's something that does concern me as well. Again, it's not enough to say, right, I'm not going to
and it's I mean, it can be a fairly simplistic objection to the concept of privilege, and I hear this from, and this is one of the pushbacks I get too. It's like, but I was white and I was poor, ergo no white privilege. But so it's important to stress that this, number one, is not the only sort of privilege that exists. There are thousands of competing privileges and disadvantages that people face, and having one does not automatically trump all the others and enable you to overcome them. And that's part of the risk, where you become so interested in the concept of white privilege that it's the most important or the only privilege or factor in the game, and it's clearly not.
Yeah, I mean, because again, I'm totally for Black Lives Matter. I'm less hesitant about the movement itself, and I know we've discussed, Phil, things about their criticism of the nuclear family and things like that, and which itself seems a little bit imperialist in a way. But one of the concerns I have, and I think people have, is about the person experience. So because I have these questions in my head and I never have anyone to ask. So, but how do you know an act is racist? Because that's what I can't find an answer to. So, because if you look in if you look in the dictionary now, a definition of racism is that it's what we usually think of is that as a white person, you think that you hold a belief that you are superior to other races. And so that old type of racism is easy to discern. If someone says, I hate black people, I hate Asian people, or something like that, well, we know what that is. We know that we can say, look, from an epistemic point of view, I know that is racist. Now, one of the issues is if someone is killed, a minority is killed by a police officer, if we can't say that every time a non-white person is killed by a police officer that is by default racist. Okay, well, I think we can all agree that, can't we? Okay, sure. That so that's so then we're in the predicament is how do we discern between the death, the killing of a non-white person that could be legitimate, from a legitimate police contact of someone who's armed, etc., and so the motivation is more obvious there. But how do we discern between the two? Because do you see what I mean? Like, there's no. That's what I'm saying. There's
no cut and dry way to do that. Well, I mean, there might be some really blatant cases. We don't know that, but no. Generally speaking, it's. I don't know. I mean, say for example, in the case of Mr. Floyd, was that racist? Well, I would be hesitant to say so. Not because I think it wasn't, but because I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is the thing about in psychology, we're human beings are terrible at accurately describing people's motivations. And in fact, I think if I'm right, that usually the more confidence you have the more confidence you have in identifying someone's motivations, it's more likely that you're actually wrong. That we're terrible. I mean, we lie to ourselves. We kind of get our own motivations sort of lined up. But
racism is beyond just motive. So George Floyd, I'd be hesitant to say that was outright racism, unless Chauvin, his 18 counts of previous issues within police were all black people, or majority black. So there may well be evidence that I just don't know that shows that it is, or at least a trend towards it. But it also, Floyd didn't happen in a vacuum. You had Arbery a few weeks before. You had Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper, who just so happen to have a surname that's similar in New York, where you've got a white woman actually changing the tone of her voice to call the police to say a black man is attacking her, who's just standing there with a phone. And so you've got this trend, quick succession events that just feel like a broader trend from the last 50, 100 years. And then you've got around it, you've got news articles of people burning crosses and things like that. So whether or not the act was racist, it has sparked racial issues that are in and of themselves racist. And then you find yourself with narratives where people post, well, actually, there are white deaths with police, but you'll see that as people go, this is happening where there's black men interacting with police and getting killed, and then you get the white guys going, well, what about white people? What about black and black violence? And then you start looking at, there's this bias within the justice system that can be seen, at least in America, by the fact that from year dot with any person who's black, they have a whole system that's kind of stacked against them. They're going to get more likely to be stopped, which then makes them more likely to be caught with something, which once they are caught, they're more likely to get caught again, but they're also more likely to have a harder fine, a harder record, and then it goes up from there. And that's the kind of racism that's not necessarily down to a single individual, but a system of bias that most, not all, most white people don't have to face. Now, a lot of white people will have poverty and other aspects that aren't privileged, but the issue is that the bias can be found through through looking at the statistics that are in there, and there's a few articles that will show that. And so while I'm very hesitant to say this is a race thing between the cop and then Floyd, it is a race thing in the society that's happening.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that racism may could play a part in that. I'm not disagreeing with that. But again, and Glenn will know more about this, is that because I just have these uncomfortable questions in my head, and I don't do it to pee people off or I'm being disingenuous. I just have like these questions. Is that if you approach a research question for like a univariate, so you basically you have one variable, okay, and if the variable is racism, you'll never get a legitimate answer to a question if there's only one possible variable. And the thing about when you look at some of the sentencing is, again, I'm not negating that some of that it may be down to racial prejudice, but a lot of it is explained by social economic demographics. So if you're is that you're proportionally more likely to to be under the poverty line. I think it's 20%. I think it's 20%. And so when you're in a system, if you're rich and white, you can go and get a lawyer. You don't have to have a rubbish one who's got 1,000 cases trying to look after you, because you're not going to get they'll mount up a certain number of charges against you, and you won't necessarily have the knowledge or expertise to get yourself out of that. So I'm not saying all of it can be explained by that, but probably a significant proportion of that can be explained by socioeconomic demographics and encounters with police. Obviously, that doesn't explain the fact that if you're non-white and you're more likely to be get into the system to begin with, that could be where there's definitely the racial element in there. But I just think, again, no one likes dealing with these questions, because again it's racism, but probably which is good, but I think it's racism and I think to have that one variable is,
I mean the way that people have sought to so I mean I don't typically approach the issue from here are the numbers of people who are killed by the police, but suppose we did. Every time I have discussed that, the pushback that I get is somewhat simplistic, and it'll be something like you can't assume that the different outcomes with the police in terms of assaults by the police, killings by the police, arrests, incarcerations, and so on are because of race, because the stats show that it occurs because blacks commit more crime. And then that's the bottom of the explanation that is given. Like, there goes no deeper than that. So which can't, in my ears, sound like anything other than black people, by virtue of being black, are more criminally inclined.
Which is horrendous, not true.
Which is and people will say, I'm not saying that. Well, then why does the explanation that you just gave me stop there, where you say it's because they commit more crime? Really? So that's the cause of this. Why do you? I mean, it's so. But you don't think, do you, that the genes that make you black make you commit more crime? Oh, no, I wouldn't say that. Okay, so what do you think's going on here? Why is that? Why are there these differences?
Yeah.
Some people would say that, you're right, but those are fewer now than they used to be.
Hopefully shrinking.
Yeah. I mean, it's as though there are no causes underlying this at all. You've got in America, you've got it's no longer true to say just this century, but in living memory for some people, there was racial segregation, for goodness sake. That makes a difference.
Mm-hmm. Have you watched 13th? Is it 13 or 13th?
I've got it on my watch list. I need to watch it.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and definitely opened my eyes to it. I know there's been criticism of it, but even the criticisms I looked, I think the general thrust of the documentary is you can clearly see, how African Americans, post-slavery started off from a point of significant disadvantage, and I think to ignore that or to negate it is just dumb. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. If you can look at that history and think that you're starting from a place of equal footing, it's just absurd to think that. And like you said, Jim Crow, people still alive now.
One downside to this, to the fact that it's all coming out of American news stories, is that we're all focusing on America instead of what's happening in our own countries. Now, in New Zealand, the Maori population suffered phenomenal disadvantages in the, especially, well, when colonization here first began. I don't have a problem, incidentally, with the concept of colonization, but the way that it was done, my God. Yeah, so sort of late 19th and most of the 20th century here, you know, these systemic disadvantages that were put in place, and people just aren't aware of them because they don't know those aspects of history. So they don't know, for example, the way that the Maori language was banned in schools. People don't know that, but it makes, and if they were aware of these things, or just the various land seizures and whatnot, economic disadvantages that exist now mean that Maori people are disproportionately facing the other types of reverse privileges that we were talking about earlier, like class privileges. Why is it, for example, that class disadvantage, you know, you can say, well, class is as much of a disadvantage, if not more. Why is it that class disadvantage shows up so often in these ethnic minority groups?
Yeah,
that's huge. And with the whole colonial aspect of things, when you see it with sort of Aborigines in Australia, and even the term that's given there, but also I've seen conversations completely negating the fact that even America was colonized, and sort of bringing up the great emancipator Lincoln as though he's this great guy that understood humanity, and the way he describes black people, it just has not aged well, and
No.
doesn't show a guy that understands being made in God's image. And then I've had it shared with me that actually it was a really good idea he had, that people should be shipped back to Africa. Like that's a solution as a Christian to, and that's what's offensive to me, is actually underlying some of these responses is outright racism. And that's the bit that's a difficulty, especially over social media, is trying to work out, well, who's read a bit of critical theory. And fortunately, I knew a few people on my thread had, and I could see where it was coming from, and they're just struggling with the terms. And who's not. And actually, some of the things that are coming out, and then the sort of the inherently more criminal type of commentary is there. But what's interesting from a personal side to me, so I grew up in Papua New Guinea, and the conversations that I've been having within the missionary community about what mission looks like when you are a mostly white mission community in a black country, and how the privileges of being in a pretty much private mission school, while down the road is a national states school that's floundering. And I come out of this country with pretty much a private education, with American teachers that have been flown in, especially with a small class and top facilities. And then knowing down the road, there's people that have grown up with very little, and there's no communication between the two. And yet we're there to translate their Bibles for them and tell them about God. And you suddenly go, what's interesting is I was aware of that because I lived with a couple of Papua New Guinean guys. I boarded at this mission school, and while my parents were in another town, and I lived with a couple of Papua New Guinean guys and could see the way that they were treated. So I was aware of it while I was there. But I've got friends who are suddenly going, "Oh my gosh, I was so privileged," and what the history of Papua New Guinea is such that the racism is completely inverted, in that the racism I faced was being called master. And I had to try and combat that with Papua New Guinean people that didn't know me, but because that's the ingrained colonization language, that you're called master. And I could have got away with a lot simply because I was white. And I know a lot of people that did. And then you look at how the Papua New Guinean guys didn't. And you're like, it is ingrained, unfortunately, at a Christian idea of mission. I mean, it's part of it is this idea of savior complex. I've got the truth. you clearly don't. Your civilization needs the truth. I need your resources. That's a bit beyond it, but there's this. I'm going to bring civilization and take from that, and there's loads of that within. That conversation's actually been healthy to suddenly see my missionary kid friends suddenly realize, yes, you did have quite a privilege to enjoy that country while not necessarily engaging in the issues.
You see, I would hear something like, "Oh, I was with a missionary family in Papua New Guinea." I'll be like, "Wow, that must have been hard."
But in some, you'd think. I mean, especially if you believe British newspapers that think that people fight off crocodiles left, right, and centre, and in some ways, missionaries do sacrifice a lot to go overseas. But if they've set up a whole community that then is pretty much designed to keep white people there, so therefore they've brought Western culture in with them, then you end up with a mess. And don't get me wrong, I loved my time out there, but then you start to realize why and what that looks like, and actually in the long term what that might do for the gospel. And so it's a whole weight, and I'm talking to people in the States who are trying to unpick being black from white evangelicalism, and you've got that going on at the moment, and we've got a little bit of that happening in the UK. What is white English Christianity, and what is black English Christianity? How do we figure out?
I worry we're already divided. I mean, because they always say, I don't know if it's true, but the most divided days in the US is a Sunday. Most segregated day is a Sunday, because you have white churches and black churches. And my worry is that is that something that's going to get even worse? Because I think that's the thing that's so beautiful about the gospel, is it brings people who are diverse together under shared belief. But there are concerns, especially around this. That is this gonna? Are we going to see more division? That's obviously what we don't want. Because I think a lot of churches get it right. I've been a white member of a majority black church. I've been a member of a majority white church, and I've been members of mixed churches. Where there's Africans, Asians, Caribbean, South Americans, European, all over the place. So I think one of my concerns at the moment is this has the potential to worsen an existing problem.
What do you reckon, Glenn? Do you reckon it's going to get worse?
No,
that's good.
I think it's going to get better. I think other than stuff like rioting and looting, I think to a large extent the consequences of this conversation being had will be good.
Yeah. I hope so.
It's a very summary statement.
They'll be good.
They'll be good.
Yeah, it'll be great. It'll be fabulous. I know that there are stereotypes about white Christianity and the way that it doesn't necessarily handle these issues well. I hate to throw other people under the bus, but I think it's more of a problem in America than it is here, and that is because there were white churches and black churches established, whereas in a place like New Zealand, fortunately, that wasn't the case. There were some indigenous varieties of Christianity that got started, like over here we have the Ratana Church, but generally speaking, the most diverse organizations that I've ever been a part of have been churches, and I think that's great. And that could just be a consequence of things being done reasonably well within the Christian faith in this part of the world, or it might just be an accident. But I think the upshot of these renewed conversations about race and ethnicity and privilege, and about what the kingdom of God should look like, is going to be positive.
I think I'm with you on that. I think this is a necessary conversation. I think what needs to be said alongside this is those who are church leaders is teaching the humility to listen rather than react. And that's what I'm at least seeing on social media, is that the knee-jerk reaction to critical theory, to white privilege, to language is generally done by those who have the privilege, and those who don't have that privilege are the ones that are being silent. And my hope in sharing certain things on Facebook is that people are allowed to speak, but actually I'm not sure that's where it's happening. And so somehow within churches, we have to cut the noise that is seen on social media and find ways to not force, but just allow people to listen in a forum where they can't speak in some ways. And Zoom is useful, I guess. You can mute people, but allowing those with from the sort of minority within the church to at least just hear their experiences, so that we can learn from them and not be those people that go, actually, what about this? What about that? What about all these other problems? What about these injustices? And that's my frustration with this whole conversation, is the number of what abouts and what ifs. And it's like, no, that's not the conversation right now. It's acknowledging that we don't have to worry about certain things that our brothers and sisters do, and we need to hear that before we then act. And I think people jump into conclusions because of the noise. That's kind of where I'm at. Hopefully that kind of translates a bit.
I think you do it well. What do you think? So then it's easier to identify ways that are unhelpful. I'm trying to think on an individual level. What do Christians do? Do we just keep quiet, listen? Because I've had some conversations with friends. Some of which have had experience, and others who say they can't necessarily identify with some of those experiences. But I think of any group, there's always going to be sort of variation of experiences. So what do we do? Is it sort of just, do you think, what would be a helpful thing for people like ourselves to do?
Who's the question for?
You, Glenn. Why don't you go first?
Gosh,
You're our guest.
That's the difficult thing, isn't it? It's easy to identify a problem. It isn't easy to identify. It's easy to tell when someone's sick. It isn't necessarily easy to know what's going to fix them. But so I guess the thing to do is to look at the examples where things have gone wrong. We've been saying that we don't know. Yeah, we've been saying that in any given instance of violence, we don't know whether or not race was a factor. But here's what I think. How about if we were, and this sounds, I would be mindful of how I say this, because in some people's ears it may sound like all lives matter, but that isn't the point. Acknowledging that people are going to carry with them certain types of unconscious bias, just acknowledging that, because it is true. How about we don't use brutality against anyone? Yeah. So that's kind of a simple answer in some particular cases. Now, I'm not a police officer, so that's not necessarily relevant to me. But in everyone's sphere of influence, they must carry with them certain the responsibilities that they carry to make a difference here is going to look different. That's why it's difficult to say what should we do, because there are a trillion things to be done. Because there are a trillion different things that we do, and millions of different lives that we lead, and the particular obligations in each case are going to be different. Ultimately, what it is going to come down to is practicing love. But what does that look like? Well, I can't tell you here and now what that looks like.
And it might look different in New Zealand than it does here in the UK, maybe.
Yeah, the UK and New Zealand, I think, are much more similar than New Zealand and the US.
And that's probably true.
That's true. Yeah,
we're a Commonwealth nation.
Yeah, got that in common. I'm feeling that the conversation's kind of trailing off a little bit on this front, and I think probably said quite a bit on there, and just some resources that I've engaged with, at least in the UK, that might be helpful for viewers. Is started following fairly, probably a couple months back, actually, timely before all this sort of blew up. There's a guy named Ben Lindsay who's written a book called "We Need to Talk About Race," and he was actually starting to look at how COVID-19 has been impacting races differently, and actually, again, part of the privilege of being white, we've actually been less impacted by COVID, it would seem, by the stats. And so he's looking into why that might be, and what can be done about it. So if anyone's watching and needs a resource just to start off with, look up Ben Lindsay, at least in the UK. Those watching in Australia and New Zealand, Glenn, do you have any resources specific to your side of the world?
Nope.
Start listening to people.
Well, that's probably a good thing to do. Well, no, it's not, because I don't have time. There are only so many issues and fields of interest and study to which you can devote yourself. Yeah,
that's true. Do you not think it's worth? And we've had this conversation, Dan. That's just brought something to mind of the issue that some people have with this whole thing. Is it almost like this language of silence is violence. So everyone has to be an activist. Do you not think we should at least encourage some element of resourcing yourself? Because that's definitely the trend on social media.
I don't know about resourcing yourself. Isn't that here are some books you have to read? I almost always reject that. There are never books you have to read. There are conversations that you should have with good, loving, wise people who will help you.
That's good.
I think it should be something that is talked about in churches. You should hear it from the pulpit. You should hear it in schools. You don't need to take home a reading list and do homework.
That's a good shout. That's helpful.
Yeah. That's far wiser an advice than I would give, because my solution is often here are some books, and I'm actually going to
same.
And we usually finish on a couple of the same questions. Did you have any more questions, Phil? Or
I've got loads, and we only.
Go.
Well, it's time. We're 1 hour 30, so we've done all right. And
pick one question.
One question. Oh, I've got to ask it.
Go on then, you go. Only if I've got one really quick one afterwards.
No, Dan, you go. I can't.
No, you go. Go on, you go.
Let's do it.
Right, Glenn Scrivener, the other Glenn, who's actually got us subscribers and stuff. When we interviewed him, he said another Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter. I haven't come across that. Have a great podcast, so he recommends them. So. Just it's a bit of a pet of mine. We could end up with another half an hour. Maybe Dan, I'm not gonna do it.
Oh, go on. I'll tell you if it's gonna take too long.
All right. Okay. So, as you know, because you've been on my other channel, I think one of the big questions that people are asking is around the topic of hell, and even recently, Rebecca McLaughlin. I haven't actually read the book, but I've seen it's in the top. She said 12 of the toughest questions for Christianity is her book. And one of them, the very last chapter, is how can a loving God send someone to hell? So obviously publishers still think this is a question worth answering. To cut a long story short, and maybe we'll lose some subscribers on this, but you and I, all three of us, hold to the view that hell consumes and destroys. How big of a part of evangelism, apologetics, how needed is that conversation from your perspective?
Evangelism can largely be done without reference to hell. But in saying that, because that when I talk about hell, when I talk about missing out, when I talk about not being saved in the end, all I'm talking about is not having eternal life, because that's what I think it amounts to. So maybe it can't be had without reference to hell. It can be made without, it can be made without reference to the doctrine of eternal torment.
Most people will have that conversation without eternal torment. That's not generally a strategy. I mean, I've been through multiple alpha courses and introductions to Christianity, and eternal conscious torment generally doesn't come up as a topic.
Yeah, and while I have some time for those courses, I think there's a lot of good in them. It seems to me that to a large extent, I mean, they do talk about resurrection, but the central focus on the gift of everlasting life and being saved from death, which to me is the most important thing in the world, and how could it not be, in my opinion, isn't talked about so much. And that's because what they would talk about in its place is so unacceptable. Because what they actually believe is something that doesn't really nicely fit into a seeker-friendly evangelistic package, and so they stop talking about hell altogether, which isn't good, because if it's part of the gospel and if it's as central as some people maintain that it is, you should talk about it, and it should be part of evangelism. Whereas for me, what I believe instead of the traditional concept of hell is central to evangelism. It's, what if this isn't all there is? What if death isn't the end? And so that becomes the gospel. What if everlasting life is the thing? What if it can happen?
Yeah, I agree. And that focus on everlasting life and new creation has just blown open evangelism for me. It makes it so much more clear, and I don't have to start wrestling with everyone else's definition of death. And suddenly I've got new creation, hope, this world, what you see in this life that's good, are glimpses of new creation. That's something to be held on to when everything else is turning to poop. It's not going to, that's not it. That's not the end. And death is not the end. We've got something. And so that language is shared, but I don't have to qualify it.
That's right. And you can really, well, not necessarily qualify it, but you can really hammer it. You can really emphasize the things that you believe, and you can just use the biblical language to do so.
Yeah. Dan, you got another question?
I was just going to say quickly, what I try and ask people is, could you, I don't know if you know, maybe 2 or 3 Christians that we might not know about, people listening, who they should find a bit more about?
See, my reading habits have changed so much. Once upon a time when I was doing my master's in theology and PhD in philosophy, I would be like, oh yeah, I've been reading this guy, you should go and pick him up. I don't read a lot of that sort of stuff these days. So it's not really new stuff. I would say to someone, look, if you're new to Christian philosophy, pick up God, Freedom and Evil by Alvin Plantinga. It's dated, but it's a really good read. That's the kind of thing I might say. So the sorts of conversations that I tend to follow now are not in the literature, because I've become so jaded by academia. So it'll more likely be, I had this really good conversation on Twitter, or I met this guy at church and we conversed about this subject and we're going to do it again.
Maybe they don't even have to be Christian thinkers. Just someone that people listening haven't heard of, you think is valuable to read or listen their stuff.
No, this actually is a Christian thinker, Edward Fraser, who is a Catholic philosopher in somewhere in the United States. I'm not sure where. I really like him. Actually, I requested him and got him actually as one of my external markers for my PhD, and he liked my work, so that makes him even better.
That's a bonus.
If you're not familiar with Brian Davies, he's also another Catholic philosopher. See, I'm not Catholic. I would never be Catholic, but I have great admiration for the Catholic intellectual tradition. Brian Davies, on his book, I think it's called The Reality of Evil and the Existence of God, or something very similar to that. It's been a little while since I read it. One of the best, because I'm hard to impress. I get bored easily, and I read a book, I think, oh, this isn't interesting, I'll put it down. His book on evil and the existence of God is absolutely gripping. It's fantastic. It's worth your time. And I know that a lot of people who are into Christian philosophy, or those who move in the apologetics circles anyway, are they're evangelical Protestants, and they might not read that sort of thing. Read Brian Davies. He's worth your time.
Yeah, I can second Brian Davies. He's probably written the best introduction to philosophy of religion as well. He's got very good. I think that's the Brian Davies. I think he's written an introduction.
That will be the same one here.
Yeah, he's it's an excellent one. Yeah, no, that's a good shout. Thank you.
Nice. Well, I think that's a fairly natural way to conclude our evening. We managed an hour and 33. So Glenn Scrivener wins on the longest podcast so far. But
you're second though.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
There's 2 Glens in
Gosh.
the top 3.
That's true.
Oh,
Yeah,
my word.
You're doing well. Is there anything else that you'd like to say before we sign off, Glenn? Are you anything from this conversation that stands out as a pithy last comment?
Yeah, just don't react too quickly. When you hear someone raising concerns about race, don't assume too much about them. You know, I'm a conservative, analytically minded Protestant Christian who has no time for progressive variants of the faith, and I'm telling you that racism matters.
Yep,
that's a good. That's a good way to end.
I think I can't say anything more pithy than that, really. Dan, have you got anything else to say?
No, just that really enjoyed talking to you, Glenn. I've been sort of talking to my wife earlier. I think I've been following your blog and podcast for probably 10 years. So it's nice to get to have a chat with you. I think
I think my peak was some time ago.
Yeah, I was going to ask how do we get you to do more podcasts? Because I used to.
Well, I'm just so busy. I mean, I'm a student again, and it's got nothing to do with philosophy or theology. I mean, I suppose I could just integrate what I'm doing now into podcasts, but you know, and I'm building guitars, and that's occupying quite a bit of time. I've actually started another podcast, but it's completely unrelated to anything we've talked about here. It's called Night Stories, and it's just stories to listen to at night before you go to bed. So you can listen to that if you want.
Yeah, give it a whirl. The other thing we need to get you to do a jingle maybe for our. You're very good at the blog jingle.
A voice for it.
Yeah, at some point I make music too. So
yeah,
there you go.
Maybe we'll be in contact for that, and we can get you to.
Nice.
Yeah. Oh, you've got the new Rethinking Hell shorts that I noticed your voice was on one of them recently.
Yeah.
You've been doing?
Yeah, it was. It was an old recording too. They obviously dug it up and said, "Let's use this."
All right. Fair enough. So people can find you on rightreason.org, and articles kind of trickle in on there. If you haven't ever come across Dr. Glenn Peebles, then check out his podcast and all the stuff from the past. And
if you Google something like Glenn Peebles is stupid, you'll find something.
I might do that just to see what comes up.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us, and maybe we'll do it again sometime, and maybe spend a little bit more time on annihilationism, as it's a pet project of mine. But anyway, just enjoy how you think and what your thoughts are on these big topics, and I really appreciate you spending an hour and a half of your time with us.
Lovely.
Cool. On that note, thank you for those of you out there that did share an hour and a half of your time with us. We greatly appreciate it. If you'd like to subscribe and like and share, hopefully you found the conversation helpful. And if you've got anything feedback-wise to add, well, put it in the comments and we'll get to it at some point, hopefully. It's been a pleasure, and we'll see you all in a week's time with Andy Bannister. That's coming up too.
Bye.
So exciting times. See you later. There we go. I think we're ended.
Okay.